Senior analyst Orthful had processed 43 first contacts. He knew what fear looked like. The humans standing in Docking Bay 7 did not look like that. They stood in ordered lines, not rigid, not military, but deliberate. No shouting, no panic. Even the children stayed close to the adults, watching, waiting. Orthful opened a new log entry and stared at the cursor for a moment before typing the first word. Inconsistency. They stood in ordered lines. Not rigid, not military, but deliberate. Each movement seemed small, almost insignificant, yet collectively it formed a pattern Orthful could not immediately define. No shouting, no panic. Even the children remained close to the adults, watching, learning, waiting. Waiting for what? He did not know. The ship itself was exactly what Command had described. Primitive, inefficient, almost embarrassing. Iron alloy hull, visible weld seams, propulsion based on chemical combustion. It was the kind of engineering a species abandoned centuries before reaching interstellar relevance. Orthful had already drafted half his report before even stepping into the observation corridor. And yet, standing behind the one-way glass, something felt incorrect. A child dropped to the floor near the center of the containment area. At first, Orthful assumed it had stumbled, but the fall was too controlled. The child remained there, tracing something invisible against the surface with a finger. Another child moved past without looking, but slowed just enough to obscure the motion from certain angles. Orthful adjusted the visual feed. There was nothing on the floor. No markings. No tools. No residue. Still, the motion repeated. Subtle. Intentional. He marked it as idle behavior and moved on. Across the room, an older human male leaned against the wall. His posture suggested fatigue, but his eyes moved constantly. Not scanning randomly, but measuring. Orthful noticed the intervals, door to guard, guard to camera, camera to ceiling junction. The man's gaze followed fixed paths, returning to the same points with quiet precision. It was not fear. It was calculation. Orthful paused longer than necessary before logging the observation. He told himself it was routine. Thorough documentation required attention to detail, even in unremarkable subjects. Especially in unremarkable subjects. Still, he did not classify the behavior as significant. A female human sat further back, separated slightly from the others. She did not speak. She did not move much at all. At first glance, she appeared disengaged, perhaps in shock. But her breathing remained steady, her posture relaxed, her gaze unfocused in a way that suggested internal processing rather than emotional withdrawal. After several seconds, she looked up, not toward the room, not toward the guards, toward the glass, directly toward it. Orthful remained still, though he knew she could not see him. The panel was engineered to prevent exactly that. There was no reflection, no distortion, no visual pathway from her side to his. And yet she held her gaze there. 1 second. 2. 5. Orthful felt a faint, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He did not immediately categorize the sensation. It was not fear. There was no threat present. The humans were contained, unarmed, compliant. Still, he looked away first. He stepped back from the observation panel and closed the feed. In his log, he wrote a single line. Subjects display atypical behavioral stability under detainment conditions. He considered adding more. The children, the old man, the woman. He did not. Instead, he finalized the entry and submitted it with the rest of the preliminary assessment. Primitive vessel. Low technological capacity. No immediate threat indicators. Clean. Professional. Accurate. At least, that was what he believed. As he exited the corridor, Orthful paused once more and glanced back at the sealed observation window. The room beyond it was quiet, orderly, controlled. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was wrong. And yet, for reasons he could not justify, he accessed the internal monitoring system again and flagged the entire group for extended observation. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were not behaving like anything he understood. He dismissed the thought almost immediately. Every new species presented minor irregularities. That was the nature of discovery. Patterns emerged over time. Explanations followed. There was always a framework. There would be one here as well. There had to be. Orthful turned away and continued down the corridor, already organizing the next phase of analysis in his mind. Behind him, in holding area 3, one of the children stood up from the floor, and quietly wiped away something only the other children had noticed. And the pattern continued. The official classification was completed within 6 standard hours. Orthel reviewed it twice before submission, not because it required correction, but because it aligned too perfectly with established models. The humans fit cleanly into every measurable category of a low-threat, emerging species. Their technology was inefficient, their propulsion outdated, their defensive capabilities negligible beyond close-range engagement. A civilization still learning how to leave its own system. The numbers supported it. The data confirmed it. There was nothing ambiguous. He recorded them as Class 2. The designation carried specific implications. Limited expansion capability. No strategic reach beyond local territory. Minimal risk of organized resistance outside isolated encounters. Standard protocol applied. Detain, document, release with territorial warning. Simple. Predictable. Safe. Orthel transmitted the classification to the Conclave Science Division and received approval without revision. That alone was a confirmation. Higher classifications triggered debate, requests for extended analysis, sometimes direct oversight. This received none of that. The humans, as far as the Conclave was concerned, were already understood. Still, Orthel returned to the observation deck. Not out of concern. He told himself it was procedural consistency. Initial classifications were often followed by secondary behavioral verification. It was good practice, nothing more. Inside the containment area, the humans had settled into a routine. Groups formed naturally, clustered by what appeared to be familial units. Food distribution had occurred without incident. No disputes. No signs of resource competition. Even the younger ones followed the distribution pattern without instruction. That was noted. Most species at this stage required external structure under detainment. Authority enforcement. Behavioral correction. These humans adapted immediately, as if structure was not something imposed on them, but something they carried internally. Orthel observed for several minutes before activating the behavioral overlay system. Movement patterns appeared across the display as faint lines, paths taken, repeated positions, interaction clusters. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then he noticed the repetition. Certain individuals moved along consistent routes, not randomly, but with slight variation each time. The differences were small, almost negligible, but they prevented complete predictability. No path was ever identical to the last. He adjusted the filter. The pattern became clearer. They were avoiding fixed routines. Orthel frowned slightly, though the expression held no real concern. Avoidance of repetition could be a stress response. Some species developed irregular habits under observation, particularly when confined. He logged it under adaptive behavioral variance. Across the room, the older male had resumed his slow movement along the perimeter. This time, Orthel focused on the intervals. Step count between walls. Time spent at each corner. Subtle pauses near structural joints. The man's physical condition suggested limited endurance, yet his movement remained consistent. Purposeful. Orthel increased the zoom. The human's hand brushed lightly against the surface at one section of the wall. Not pressing, not marking, just confirming, as if verifying something already known. Then he moved on. No tools. No visible alterations. No damage. Orthel marked it as tactile environmental familiarity. A harmless behavior. He shifted his attention to another section of the room. 2 adults were speaking quietly, their voices too low for standard audio capture. The translation system attempted to process fragments, but the structure was inconsistent with the primary human language database. Shortened forms, altered phrasing, context-dependent meaning. The system flagged it as incomplete translation. Orthel did not escalate it. Emerging species often displayed linguistic variation, dialects, informal speech patterns, localized expressions. It was not unusual. Nothing here was unusual. Everything had an explanation. That was the conclusion he returned to repeatedly. At the far end of the containment area, the same woman remained seated. This time she was not looking at the wall. She was watching the room, but not in a general sense. Her focus shifted between individuals at specific intervals, never lingering too long, never appearing fixed. Observing without being seen to observe. Orthel noted the behavior, then paused before categorizing it. There was a structure to her attention. A rhythm he could not immediately quantify. It did not align with stress, fear, or passive awareness. It resembled assessment. He dismissed the thought. A Class II species did not conduct structured behavioral assessment under detainment. They reacted. They coped. They survived. They did not analyze. Orthful finalized the observation log and prepared the secondary report. No threat escalation. No deviation from initial classification. Behavioral anomalies present, but within acceptable variance. He hesitated for a moment before submitting. A brief, almost imperceptible delay. Then he confirmed the transmission. As the report left his console, Orthful leaned back slightly and allowed the familiar certainty of the classification system to settle his thoughts. The framework had existed for centuries. It had never failed. Every species encountered had followed predictable developmental paths. There was no reason to believe this one would be different. Behind the glass, the humans continued their quiet routines. Measured steps, subtle glances, conversations that revealed nothing and concealed everything. Orthful closed the observation feed. He did not notice that, at the exact moment he did, 3 separate individuals in the room shifted their positions in perfect, unspoken coordination. Not reacting to him, not responding to anything visible, but adjusting, as if they had just confirmed something, and moved on. The anomalies did not appear all at once. They surfaced gradually, spaced far enough apart to seem insignificant when viewed individually. Orthful would later understand that this spacing was not accidental. At the time, he recorded each one as a minor irregularity, disconnected from the others, easily explained. The first was the children. Observation Post 4 provided a full view of Holding Area 3, where the youngest humans spent most of their time. Orthful activated the feed during a routine cycle and found them engaged in what appeared to be a simple game. No equipment, no defined boundaries, just movement across the open floor. One child stood facing the wall, eyes covered, counting in a steady rhythm. The others scattered, hiding behind larger bodies, shifting positions, crouching low. Primitive social bonding behavior. Orthful almost ended the observation there. Then he noticed the hands. 2 of the children, positioned near opposite sides of the room, made brief, subtle gestures before moving. Not random, not playful. The movements were precise, repeated across multiple rounds. Small changes in finger position, slight angles of the wrist. Communication. He enhanced the feed. Each signal was acknowledged by another child with a nearly imperceptible response. A shift in stance. A change in direction. Timing adjustments that allowed them to avoid detection longer than probability would suggest. The seeker turned, scanning the room, but its gaze consistently landed on the wrong target first. By the time it corrected, the others had already repositioned. Orthful watched 6 rounds. Not once were both targets found simultaneously. He leaned slightly closer to the display. The pattern was evolving. By the 4th round, the signals had become smaller, more efficient. Less movement, same outcome. The children were refining the process in real time, eliminating unnecessary motion, improving coordination without verbal instruction. He paused the feed and replayed the sequence. The result did not change. Orthful marked it as cooperative play behavior with adaptive elements. Still harmless. Still within expected variance. He moved on. The second anomaly was more subtle. It came from the audio logs. 2 adults, identified as non-essential personnel within the colony manifest, engaged in quiet conversation during a low-activity period. The translation system processed fragments, then stalled, not due to unknown language, but due to inconsistency. The structure shifted mid-sentence. Words carried multiple meanings depending on placement. Context altered interpretation in ways the system could not stabilize. It flagged the exchange as linguistically unstable and defaulted to partial translation. Orthful reviewed the raw audio. The tone was calm, measured. No urgency, no emotional spikes. Yet the rhythm of the conversation suggested something more complex than casual exchange. Pauses were deliberate. Responses aligned too precisely with unspoken cues. He isolated one segment and ran it through a deeper analysis. The system returned multiple possible translations, none fully accurate. Orthful closed the file. Language variation. Nothing more. The third anomaly was visual. The older male, Gregor Vasic, according to the manifest, had altered his routine. Previously, his movements followed the perimeter. Now, He spent longer intervals near the rear section of the containment area. The wall there was structurally identical to the others. No access points. No visible differences. Yet he returned to it repeatedly. Orthful focused on the man's hands. At first, there was nothing. Just contact with the surface, light pressure, movement along the lower section of the wall. Then, during a magnified pass, Orthful detected a faint discoloration. He enhanced the image. A thin line. Dark. Irregular. Too precise to be accidental. He increased the resolution further. The line connected to another, forming an angle. Then another. A pattern beginning to take shape, incomplete but intentional. The material composition registered as organic. Trace elements consistent with human biological matter. Blood. Orthful stared at the display for several seconds without logging the observation. The quantity was minimal. The lines were thin, controlled, applied with care. No signs of injury beyond superficial surface damage. The man continued his work without visible discomfort. Not an act of desperation. An act of construction. Orthful considered flagging it as a security concern. He did not. Instead, he saved the image to a private folder and labeled it for later review. His reasoning was immediate and efficient. The map, if it was a map, was incomplete. It lacked scale, lacked context, lacked accuracy. And the subject creating it was physically compromised. No threat. He moved on. The fourth anomaly did not come from movement or speech. It came from stillness. The woman, Delara Oae, had not changed her position significantly since the initial observation cycle. She remained seated, posture relaxed, gaze shifting occasionally across the room. But now Orthful noticed something else. Her attention was selective. She did not watch everyone. Only certain individuals. At specific times. Her focus aligned with moments of movement. Small changes, subtle exchanges, the same ones Orthful himself had begun to notice. She was tracking them. Not reacting. Tracking. Orthful felt the same faint tightening in his chest as before. The sensation returned without warning, without clear cause. He attempted to categorize it again and failed. It was not fear. It was something adjacent to it. He logged the observation as directed attention behavior, then paused. For a brief moment, he considered linking the anomalies together. The children, the language, the markings, the woman. A pattern could be constructed. A system of behavior, coordinated at a low level, distributed across individuals without central command. He dismissed the idea. The complexity required for such coordination exceeded the capabilities of a Class II species. There was no technological support, no communication infrastructure, no visible hierarchy enforcing it. Independent anomalies. That was the correct classification. Orthful finalized the entries and closed the file. As he stood to leave the observation station, he glanced once more at the containment area. Everything appeared as it should. Orderly. Calm. Controlled. The children continued their game. The old man traced another line. The woman shifted her gaze. Nothing had changed. Nothing was wrong. And yet, as Orthful exited the room, he found himself replaying the sequences in his mind, not as separate observations, but as fragments of something larger. Something he could not yet see. Behind him, in holding Area 3, the children began another round. This time, the signals were so small the cameras barely registered them. And the seeker never found either of them. The realization did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, reluctantly, as if Orthful's mind resisted assembling the pieces even when they were placed directly in front of him. The first clear break came on day 5. A routine visual sweep flagged minor irregularities along the rear wall of holding Area 1. The system marked it as low-priority surface variation, nothing that required immediate attention. Orthful reviewed it out of habit, expecting to confirm the automated assessment and move on. Instead, he paused the feed. The lines were no longer random. They had structure now. Angles connected with intention. Intersections formed nodes. The spacing between segments followed measurable ratios. What had previously appeared incomplete now extended across a wider section of the wall, forming something that could no longer be dismissed as incidental. Orthful enhanced the image. The material composition confirmed his earlier observation. Blood, applied in thin, controlled strokes. The source, Gregor Vasic, stood several steps away, speaking quietly with another human as if nothing of significance had occurred. Orthful overlaid the station's architectural schematics. The alignment was not exact. It was close enough. He adjusted the scale. Closer. Another adjustment. The lines shifted into place. Corridors. Junction points. Access pathways. Not perfectly accurate, but not random either. A representation built from observation alone, constructed without tools, refined through repetition. Orthful felt the same tightening sensation return, sharper this time. He ran the comparison again. The map was missing 2 corridors. He told himself that mattered. It meant the data was incomplete. The representation flawed. A partial reconstruction based on limited exposure. Nothing more than an approximation. Still, he did not move the file into the official system. He stored it separately. Private. Unclassified. The second break came from the audio logs. The fragmented conversations he had previously dismissed were reprocessed through a deeper contextual analysis. The system still failed to produce stable translations, but new patterns emerged. Certain phrases repeated across different speakers, slightly altered each time, embedded within otherwise normal dialogue. Markers, not for meaning, but for timing. Orthful isolated one exchange and aligned it with the visual feed. A phrase was spoken. 3 seconds later, a shift occurred across the room. 2 individuals changed position. A third adjusted posture. The movement was subtle, but synchronized. He ran the sequence again. The timing held. The words were not carrying information in the traditional sense. They were triggers. Orthful leaned back from the console, his thoughts moving faster now, trying to reorganize what he had already seen. The anomalies were no longer isolated. They connected, each one reinforcing the others, forming a structure that had been present from the beginning. He opened the observation feed again. Holding Area 3. The children were playing. At least, that was how it appeared. He slowed the playback. Frame by frame. The hand signals were smaller now, nearly invisible. The response is faster. Movements overlapping in ways that created temporary blind spots within the room's surveillance coverage. They were not just hiding. They were learning positioning, learning timing, learning how to move without being seen. Orthful stopped the playback. For the first time since the humans had been brought aboard, he did not log the observation immediately. He stood instead, motionless, staring at the paused image. A thought formed. Clear. Unavoidable. This was not adaptation. It was preparation. He dismissed it. Immediately. The classification system did not support that conclusion. Preparation implied foresight beyond the current situation. It implied intent that extended past survival. A Class II species did not engage in structured preparation under detainment conditions. They reacted. They endured. They waited. They did not build systems. Orthful returned to his console and opened the initial boarding report. 3 humans had resisted. Minimal force required to subdue them. Returned to general population. No further incidents. He replayed the footage. The resistance was brief, controlled. No panic. No escalation beyond what was necessary to create disruption. Each movement precise, directed, ending the moment it achieved its purpose. Not an emotional response. A calculated one. Orthful paused the recording. Another connection. The woman. Delara Oe. Her gaze patterns, her selective attention, the way she tracked movement across the room without appearing to do so. He accessed her profile. Agricultural Planning Coordinator. Soil Composition. Water Systems. Long-term resource management. Not a strategist. Not a threat. And yet, Orthful reopened the observation feed. She was looking at the wall again. Not at the markings themselves, but at the space around them. Measuring distances. Estimating scale. Her eyes moved in small increments, stopping at points that aligned with intersections on the map. She was verifying it. Not creating. Verifying. Orthful felt the tightening in his chest spread slightly, no longer contained, no longer easy to ignore. It was not fear. There was still no immediate danger. The humans were contained, unarmed, under constant surveillance. But the certainty was gone, replaced by something else. A question. He opened a new file, separate from the official system. No classification tag, no reference number. He hesitated for a moment before typing. Behavioral observations suggest coordinated activity beyond individual adaptation. He stopped. Read the line, then added another. Possible distributed problem-solving structure present across multiple subjects. He leaned back, staring at the words. This was not standard procedure. This was not necessary. And yet, he continued. He documented the children's signals, the linguistic triggers, the map, the woman's observations. Each entry precise, controlled, written in the same detached tone he used for every report. But this one was not being submitted. Not yet. When he finished, he closed the file and secured it. Private. Unseen. Orthful stood and moved toward the observation corridor once more. Behind the glass, nothing had changed. The humans ate. They spoke. They rested. They complied. Everything appeared normal. Everything fit within the parameters of a controlled environment. Orthful watched them for several minutes without activating any analysis systems. No overlays. No filters. Just observation. The old man shifted position. The woman adjusted her gaze. A child moved 2 steps to the left, blocking a line of sight for less than a second. Small things. Insignificant things. Except they were not. Orthful understood that now. He just did not yet understand what it meant. And for the first time since the humans had been brought aboard, he did not feel certain that the classification was correct. The change did not announce itself. There was no alarm, no sudden escalation, no visible disruption in the controlled order of the detention level. Everything continued exactly as it had before. Measured movement, quiet conversation, predictable routines. That was what made it difficult to see. Orthful only noticed it because he had started looking for something that should not exist. He began with the timelines. Every recorded interaction since the humans had been brought aboard was reprocessed through his private system. Movement logs, audio fragments, environmental scans. He layered them together, searching for deviation. At first, the data confirmed what the official reports had already stated. Compliance. Stability. No escalation. Then he adjusted the scale. Instead of looking for events, he looked for progression. The pattern shifted. What had appeared static was not static at all. It was advancing in increments so small they disappeared when viewed individually. Movement paths became more efficient. Communication intervals shortened. The gaps between observation and response narrowed across the entire group. They were improving. Not randomly. Systematically. Orthful isolated a 24-hour segment and compared it to the first day of detainment. The difference was measurable. Subtle, but undeniable. He felt the now familiar tightening again. Sharper this time, accompanied by a quiet realization that formed without permission. They had not stabilized. They had optimized. He closed the comparison and sat back, letting the thought settle. Optimization required a goal, a defined endpoint, something beyond survival. Orthful accessed the external communication logs. Standard procedure ensured that all transmissions from detained vessels were intercepted, analyzed, and either blocked or delayed depending on classification. The human distress beacon had been logged at the moment of capture, its signal projected to reach the nearest relay in 14 months. A clean delay. Plenty of time. Orthful reviewed the data again. The signal path, the encoding structure, the transmission pattern. Everything matched expectations. He almost closed the file, then paused. The encoding carried redundancy beyond necessity. Layers within layers, repetition that served no clear purpose in a standard distress call. It increased signal integrity, yes, but at the cost of efficiency. Unless efficiency was not the priority. Orthful ran a deeper analysis. The system returned no anomalies. He ran it again with expanded parameters. Still nothing. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, focusing not on what was present, but on what was missing. There was no variation, no error, no deviation at all. Perfect consistency. Too perfect. Orthful exhaled slowly and closed the file. There was no proof, nothing actionable, and yet the thought remained. The signal had done exactly what it was supposed to do. That did not mean it was the only thing it had done. He returned to the observation feed. Holding Area 1, Gregor Vasic sat near the wall, hands resting loosely in his lap. The map behind him had expanded again, the missing corridors now faintly outlined, incomplete but closer to accuracy than before. Orthful overlaid the latest structural scan. The alignment improved. Not perfect, but approaching it. The old man had not been guessing. He had been refining. Across the room, Paulo Reyes, colony engineer, was engaged in quiet conversation with 2 others. His gestures were minimal, controlled, often directed toward the ceiling or the upper corners of the walls. At first glance, they appeared meaningless. Orthful replayed the sequence with environmental overlays active. Each gesture aligned with structural points. Load-bearing joints. Access seams. Pressure thresholds. He was not speaking about the room. He was measuring it. Orthful felt his thoughts accelerating. Connections forming faster now, linking observations he had previously kept separate. The teacher, Jinhee Park. Her conversations. Her questions. He accessed the interview logs. 12 questions embedded within standard dialogue. Casual in tone, harmless in structure. Biological details. Cultural practices. Governance. And then, patrol rotation. Shift intervals. Command hierarchy. Orthful stopped the playback. He remembered the moment he had ended the interview early, the faint sense that something had shifted without him fully understanding how. Now he understood. The questions had not been curiosity. They had been collection. He stood abruptly, the motion sharper than intended, and moved toward the observation corridor. Behind the glass, the humans continued their routines. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He watched them in silence, no longer trying to categorize each behavior individually. The pattern was visible now, not in any single action, but in the way those actions aligned. The old man mapping. The engineer measuring. The teacher gathering information. The woman verifying. The children practicing movement. Not separate roles. Components. Orthful felt the tightening in his chest settle into something colder, more defined. Understanding. Not complete, but enough. This was not a group of individuals responding to captivity. This was a system. Distributed. Redundant. Adaptive. He stepped back from the glass, his mind moving quickly now, tracing the implications. If they were gathering data, if they were refining it, if they were optimizing behavior across the entire group, then the question was no longer whether they were preparing. It was for what? Orthful returned to his console and opened the private file. He added a single line beneath his previous entries. Coordinated activity indicates objective beyond immediate survival. He stared at the words for several seconds, then added another. Timeline suggests planning initiated prior to full environmental understanding. He stopped. That was the point. They had started before they had the information, before they knew the layout, before they knew the duration of detainment. They had assumed that whatever came next would require preparation. Orthful closed his eyes briefly, the realization settling fully into place. They had begun on day one, not because they knew what would happen, but because they knew something would. He opened his eyes and looked back at the observation feed. The humans moved as they always had. Calm, orderly, controlled, working. Orthful felt the last fragment of certainty dissolve. The classification still existed. The reports still held. The system still said they were not a threat. But the system was no longer enough. Because for the first time, Orthful understood something the system did not account for. The humans were not reacting to the situation they were in. They were preparing for the one that had not happened yet. The war began exactly as predicted. That was the first confirmation Orthful received when the initial combat reports reached the analysis center. The Veth fleet moved with precision, executing a standard territorial enforcement operation against a species with limited reach and inferior technology. Outer human positions collapsed quickly. Defensive lines broke under sustained pressure. Casualty projections aligned with pre-engagement models. Clean. Efficient. Expected. Orthful read the reports with the calm detachment of a scientist observing a controlled experiment. The classification held. The conclusions were correct. The system worked. For the first 3 days, nothing challenged that belief. Then the fourth report arrived. It was minor. A single engagement, low strategic value. Human resistance lasted longer than projected by a small margin. Not enough to trigger concern. Not enough to alter any official assessment. Orthful noted it and moved on. The fifth report carried a similar deviation. The sixth, slightly more. Individually, each difference was insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern Orthful could not ignore. He opened a comparative model and aligned the engagements side by side. The trend became visible. Human units were still losing, but they were losing differently. Positions that had collapsed instantly in earlier engagements now held for measurable intervals longer. Defensive structures appeared in locations that had previously been exposed. Movement patterns shifted in response to Veth tactics with increasing speed. Not dramatically, incrementally. Orthful adjusted the timeline. The changes were not random. Each engagement corrected a specific weakness from the one before it. He leaned closer to the display, eyes moving across the data, tracing the progression. The humans were not improving in a general sense. They were refining. Targeted. Precise. He accessed the field logs. A Veth strike unit reported encountering resistance that mirrored their own entry pattern from a previous operation. The human defenders had anticipated the approach angle, reinforcing the exact point that had been exploited in the prior engagement. Orthful cross-referenced the locations. The connection held. They had learned. Another report described a failed Veth flanking maneuver. The maneuver itself was standard, effective against multiple species. The human response neutralized it within seconds, redirecting force to intercept before full deployment. Orthful ran the sequence again. The timing was too accurate. Not guessed. Understood. He felt the tightening in his chest return, no longer unfamiliar, no longer easy to dismiss. It settled into something heavier now, something that carried weight. Recognition. He opened his private file. They are not adapting randomly, he wrote. Each engagement produces a specific correction applied to the next. He paused, considering the phrasing, then added, learning rate exceeds projected capability for Class 2 species. He stopped typing and looked back at the data. The pattern continued. Engagement after engagement. Loss after loss. Improvement after improvement. The Veth were still winning. That was the official conclusion. Territory gained. Positions secured. Human forces retreating. All metrics supported continued success. But Orthful was no longer looking at territory. He was looking at cost. He overlaid casualty reports across the timeline. The line moved upward. Slowly. Consistently. Each victory required slightly more effort than the last. Each engagement extracted a higher price. Not enough to trigger alarm. Enough to matter. Orthful sat back, eyes fixed on the display, watching the line extend forward, one increment at a time. It did not fluctuate. It did not decrease. It only moved in one direction. He searched for the correct term. An engineering concept surfaced. A mechanism that advanced step by step, locking into place with each movement, preventing reversal. A ratchet. Orthful whispered the word quietly, testing it against the data. It fit. Each human loss was not simply a loss. It was a data point. Each engagement added to a structure that could not be undone. He opened another report. A Veth commander described encountering human forces that appeared to be running drills during active combat. Two individuals exchanged information mid-engagement, adjusting positioning while under fire, their communication calm, precise, instructional. Teaching, while fighting. Orthful read the report twice. Then a third time. The wording did not change. He felt something shift internally, a subtle but irreversible adjustment in how he interpreted what he was seeing. This was not a species struggling to survive a superior force. This was a system processing information at speed. The next report confirmed it further. A human position had been abandoned just before a Veth strike. Supplies remained, but only those of minimal value. Critical resources had been removed in advance. The layout of the remaining materials suggested intentional placement, designed to be taken quickly. A trap, not explosive, informational. The Veth had gained nothing of use. The humans had lost nothing that mattered. Orthful closed the report slowly. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was accelerating. He accessed the strategic overview. Human forces continued to retreat. Sector after sector. Planetary positions falling. From a distance, it looked like collapse. Up close, it looked like movement. Deliberate. Measured. Each retreat repositioned Veth forces, extending their lines, redistributing their strength across wider areas. Orthful traced the deployments. The structure emerged. Not a defense. A setup. He stood from his console and paced once across the room. The motion automatic, driven by the need to align his thoughts. The humans were not trying to hold ground. They were shaping the battlefield. Every loss fed into the next engagement. Every engagement refined the system. Every refinement increased the cost. He stopped. The realization settled fully, cold and precise. They were not losing. They were building. Orthful returned to his console and opened the private file again. They are converting losses into advantage, he wrote. Each engagement improves future performance. He hesitated, then added, the process is cumulative. Irreversible. He stared at the words for several seconds, then closed the file. Outside the analysis center, The war continued exactly as the Conclave had predicted. Victory reports. Territory secured. Enemy in retreat. Everything aligned with expectation. Orthful looked back at the rising line on his display and understood, with growing certainty, that the numbers were telling a different story, one that had not yet reached its conclusion, one that, once it did, would not move backward. The truth was not hidden. It had been available from the beginning, stored in a place no one had thought to look. Orthful received the archive without context, a data package extracted from the human network during a routine infiltration attempt. The team that retrieved it had flagged it as unusually dense, but offered no further interpretation. It was forwarded through standard channels, categorized as cultural and historical material with limited immediate relevance to active operations. Orthful opened it out of habit. The first section was labeled in translation as Military History Comprehensive Record. He expected scattered conflicts, border disputes, isolated engagements typical of a developing species. What he found was a list. Organized, indexed, complete, hundreds of entries. Orthful paused, assuming a translation error. The number was inconsistent with any known developmental model. Even highly aggressive species did not sustain continuous conflict across extended timelines without collapse. He accessed the raw data. The count remained. 416 distinct wars. Documented, dated, cross-referenced. And this was only the primary archive. There were subdivisions, conflicts within conflicts, regional wars, internal wars. Orthful stopped reading for several seconds, his mind attempting to reconcile the scale of it. Internal wars. A species that fought itself, repeatedly, and survived. He continued. The dates extended back thousands of years. The earliest records predated advanced technology, describing conflicts fought with primitive tools, evolving over centuries into industrial-scale warfare, then into modern strategic systems. A continuous progression, each war building on the last, each conflict refining the next. Orthful felt the tightening in his chest return, no longer sharp, no longer sudden, but constant. He opened the next section. Strategic theory. The first document was ancient by any standard. The language was structured differently, older, but the translation resolved enough to reveal its purpose. It was not ceremonial. It was instructional. A guide. Detailed. Specific. On deception. On positioning. On understanding an enemy's perception as much as their capability. Orthful read slowly, then faster, then stopped and began cross-referencing. Every concept described in the text appeared in the current war. The feints, the misdirection, the manipulation of expectation. None of it was new. It was established, codified, taught. He set the document aside and opened another. More recent, denser, analytical. It described war not as chaos, but as a system, variables, dependencies, points of failure. A concept emerged repeatedly, something translated as center of gravity. The idea that every opponent possessed a critical point upon which their strength depended. Find it. Disrupt it. The rest would follow. Orthful leaned back slightly, his thoughts aligning with uncomfortable clarity. The Veth command structure. Centralized. Predictable. Dependent on accurate interpretation of data. He opened the next file. A framework focused on speed. Not of movement, but of decision. Observe. Interpret. Act. Repeat. Faster than the opponent could process. Orthful closed his eyes briefly. He had seen this. Not in theory. In the data. Human responses arriving before Veth analysis cycles completed. Adjustments made while Veth forces were still executing previous strategies. They were not reacting to events. They were moving ahead of them. Orthful opened the casualty tables. Numbers organized by century. He scanned the entries once, then again more carefully. The scale exceeded anything in Veth history. Entire populations affected. Repeatedly. Across generations. He felt a brief, involuntary pause in his breathing. How are they still here? The thought formed without intention. The answer followed. Because they learned. Every war added to the archive. Every loss recorded. Analyzed. Refined. He moved to the next section. Military psychology. Orthful read it in fragments at first, then continuously. It did not describe weapons. It described people. What sustained conflict did to them. How fear altered decision-making. How uncertainty degraded performance. how prolonged exposure changed behavior in predictable ways. And then, how to use that, not as a consequence of war, as a tool within it. Orthful sat very still. The Veth had never studied this. There had been no need. Their wars were few, contained, limited. They ended. Human wars did not appear to end in the same way. They accumulated, each one feeding into a larger structure of understanding. Orthful returned to the current operational data. The confusion in Veth command, the delays, the misinterpretations, the growing hesitation at the strategic level. It matched the descriptions precisely, not incidentally, deliberately. He opened his private file. For a long moment, he did not write. Then, slowly, he began. What we are observing is not adaptation. He paused, considering the words. Then continued. Adaptation is reactive. It occurs over time under pressure. He stopped again. The distinction mattered. He added the next line. This is proactive, systematic, intentional. Orthful leaned back, staring at the text. The conclusion formed fully now, no longer fragmentary, no longer uncertain. The humans were not learning how to fight this war. They already knew how to fight war itself. This was not a new experience for them. It was a continuation. Another entry in a record that extended far beyond the current conflict. He typed again. They do not respond to war as an event. A pause. They treat it as a process. Orthful read the lines twice, then once more. The truth was no longer theoretical. It was supported, documented, proven across thousands of years. He closed the file. In the silence that followed, one final realization settled into place, heavier than the rest. The Veth had entered this conflict believing they were engaging a developing species. They had been wrong. They were engaging a species that had been studying war longer than the Veth had known space. And for the first time, Orthful understood why the data refused to stabilize. Why every model drifted. Why every prediction failed over time. The system they were fighting was not static. It was built to change, built to improve, built from centuries of accumulated experience. He looked back at the archive, at the hundreds of recorded wars, at the theories, the frameworks, the analyses, all of it preserved, all of it applied. And the final thought came, quiet and unavoidable. This was not something the humans had become. This was something they had always been. The turning point did not appear as a single event. There was no moment where the Veth command declared a loss. No clear line where victory shifted from one side to the other. The reports continued as they always had, positions taken, sectors contested, engagements resolved. On paper, the war still followed the same pattern. But the pattern no longer meant what it used to. Orthful saw it first in the distribution maps. Veth forces were expanding, holding more territory than before, their presence stretched across multiple systems. It looked like dominance. It looked like control. Until he overlaid the cost. The numbers no longer aligned with efficiency. Every position gained required disproportionate resources to maintain. Every secured region demanded increased reinforcement. Supply lines extended, thinned, became vulnerable in ways they had not been at the beginning. He traced the deployments again. The structure was no longer stable. It was strained. Orthful opened the latest engagement reports. 31 separate counterattacks. Launched within 18 hours. Across 3-star systems. Each one targeting a position the Veth had taken in the previous months. Each one striking at a specific weakness, supply junctions, communication relays, isolated units positioned just beyond immediate support range. Not random. Not desperate. Precise. He cross-referenced the targets with his earlier cost analysis. The correlation was exact. The humans knew which positions had been expensive to take. They knew which ones would be expensive to hold. And they had waited. Not because they were unable to act sooner. Because they had chosen the moment. Orthful leaned back slowly, the realization settling with a clarity that left no space for doubt. The retreats. The losses. The entire sequence of the past 18 months. It had not been collapse. It had been arrangement. The Veth had advanced exactly where the humans needed them to be. He accessed the command communications. Urgency had replaced certainty. Requests for clarification. Conflicting interpretations of human movement. Delays in decision-making where none had existed before. Orthful recognized the pattern immediately. It matched the psychological models in the archive. Uncertainty. Accumulated. Applied over time. Degrading response. The humans had not only shaped the battlefield, they had shaped the decisions made upon it. He stood and moved to the central display, watching the tactical map update in real time. Veth positions flickered, signals disrupted, supply routes severed. Not everywhere. Not completely. Just enough. Always just enough. The system was unraveling, not through a single decisive blow, but through continuous pressure applied at precise points. Orthful felt no confusion now, no uncertainty, only recognition. This was the process, working exactly as designed. A message arrived from the front. No formal structure, no classification, just data. After-action analysis from the fleet commander. Orthful opened it. He read in silence, his eyes moving steadily across the report. There was no panic in the text, no emotional language, only something he had not seen before from Veth Command. Acknowledgement. The models were no longer predictive. The enemy was no longer behaving within known parameters. The war was no longer operating under understood rules. Orthful closed the report. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching the shifting map, the lines of control that no longer represented control in any meaningful way. He thought back to the beginning. The ship, the quiet, the children playing a game that was not a game, the old man drawing lines in blood, the woman watching, measuring, waiting. They had never been passive. They had never been reacting. They had been building this. From the first moment, before the first engagement, before the first decision, Orthful returned to his console and opened his private file one final time. He did not review the previous entries. He did not need to. The conclusion was already there, carried not in the text, but in everything he had seen. He added a final line. We believe they were learning to fight us. He paused, then completed it. They were teaching us how they fight. Orthful read the sentence once, then closed the file. Around him, the analysis center continued its work. Data flowed. Reports updated. The system functioned exactly as it always had. But the meaning had changed. The Veth had entered the war expecting resolution. An endpoint. A conclusion that could be reached, measured, and recorded. The humans had never treated it that way. For them, there was no clean end. Only continuation. Only the next iteration. Orthful looked once more at the tactical display. At the shifting positions. At the steady, irreversible movement of the line he had been tracking since the beginning. The ratchet. Advancing. Locking. Never moving back. And in that moment, the final understanding settled completely. The Veth had not been fighting a war they could win or lose. They had been pulled into a process they did not control. One that had started long before them. One that would continue long after. Orthful turned away from the display. For the first time, he did not try to fit what he had learned into the classification system. There was no category for this. No framework that could contain it. Only a truth that had revealed itself too late. The humans were not dangerous because they were strong. Not because they were advanced. But because they did something no other species had ever done. They did not wait for war to change them. They changed themselves for war. And once that process began, it did not stop. It could not stop. Because it was not something they chose. It was something they had become. And the Veth had learned it the only way that mattered. The hard way.